Hi, welcome to 2020 Tasty Treats with GourmetQuilter. We're having a bit of fun this year with some all sorts of different patterns going on. We've got some foundation piece blocks happening at the moment. So there's 20 different blocks, and this is a diagram of the blocks that we're doing. We've already done some of our blocks. We've done 7 already, so we're on to block 8, which is pretty impressive. We've had a lot of fun. We've got all these things going on. Last time we made a coffee cup, or cup for coffee. This time we're making the coffee pot. So this is my pot here. This is most of it put together already, but I've just left some to show you how we're doing some of the foundation piecing. So we're foundation piecing onto paper. If you've already signed up with GourmetQuilter to receive the pattern, this is what you're likely to have. It's going to be printable so that you can print all your segments out. So we've got several segments on this one. There's actually 8. So that seems like a lot, but some of them are just small pieces so that we can join the next group together. So it's not really like it's particularly hard. It's just a fairly fine-tuned way of working so that we can get lots of detail and unusual angles into our work. So we're sewing onto the paper foundation. So we're cutting the pieces out roughly with a little margin around them so that we can trim them back to the dotted line when the fabrics are on them. So this time I'm just going to be making this spout for the coffee pot. So it's this piece here, which is piece D on the pattern. So we start off with piece D1, which is going to be the actual coloured piece for the spout. And so I'm just going to suggest that because it's a fairly long shape, I'm going to suggest that we just use a little bit of glue from a glue stick just to hold it. You can pin it, but I do find that pins do get a little bit in the way. So you don't want very much glue because it's got to come out. We want it to definitely be something that can be removed, washed out, or something like that. Just a gentle little dab of glue. So I've got my piece 1 ready to go now. So now I have to put on piece D2, which is just a tiny little corner, but it gives us that shape that we need for the spout. So I've already cut my pieces ready to go here. So I'm just going to pop that behind that piece there. So what we have to remember is that when we stitch along that line, the piece of fabric is going to flip so that our seam is like that. So we're kind of working back to front. So you always have to make sure that there's going to be enough fabric for when you flip it over. And so with something as small as this, you're pretty much guaranteed you're going to have enough fabric, but you do need to just double check that that is going to come out where you want it to. So I'm just going to go to the sewing machine. We've got a smaller than normal stitch, a 1.5 instead of a 2.5. I've got a regular needle in my machine. I've got regular 50 weight cotton thread. So nothing unusual, just sewing on lines, back to front basically. So there's only a short little seam this one. We're stitching a little bit beyond the line here and right out to the seam allowance there. And so I've stitched that piece on. I can double check before I cut anything that that's going to cover that little triangle, and it is easily. So then I'm going to fold that paper down along that sewing line. It'll fold easily because we've perforated it with the stitching. I'm going to just trim that off. And I'm just going to press that seam. Tiny though it is, I find it's very helpful to press everything as I go. It just helps everything come together better in the end. So that's piece number 2. So now we need piece number 3. So that's one of these long pieces again. So this one we have to take just a little bit more care with to make sure it's going to cover right out to that edge there. And this piece, so one way of doing that, to check all this, would be to fold the line of the paper along that stitching line that we're about to use. So if you fold it along that line, when you place your fabric behind, and you can fold the piece of fabric that's sitting there over as well, because most of this is going to be trimmed off, and as long as you know where the stitching line is starting and stopping, you can position that on your piece of fabric that you're going to stitch, and you just probably want to make sure that's big enough, and I don't think mine is actually quite long enough, so I'm just going to cut a longer piece here. I'd rather be safe than sorry. When you use these smaller stitching lengths, it's a whole lot harder to unpick. So you don't want to have to unpick if you don't have to. So what we're trying to do is cover this whole area here. So it actually looks a whole lot like this piece of fabric that I've folded over there, so I could safely do that and I'm going to be stitching along that line there, which is where I folded it, and I need to know that when that's flipped back, which will be roughly along that line, it's going to cover this whole region here, and now that I've cut that larger piece, it's definitely going to work. So I'm happy with that. As I said, fold along your stitching line and make sure that your fabric is covered for the area of the piece of fabric that you're trying to stitch on. So we've got plenty of fabric there now. I'm going to stitch along that line, and that's all going to work beautifully. We're taking this right out to the seam allowance. So now I'm going to fold that line again where I've just stitched now. I'm going to trim off, so don't fold any fabrics or anything back yet. Trim off this excess that we really don't need that's here. Now I can fold my paper back and my fabric over, and I've got plenty of fabric covering this region that I needed to cover. So I'm going to press that. You could just finger press these, or if you have one of those nice little rollers, you could roller it, but I find that the iron gives us a better press. So we've put number 3 on now, so that's great. Now I need to put piece number 4 on. So I'm just going to use this piece here. It's just a small piece at the top here, but remember you've got to cover right out to the seam allowance as well. So we're going to be flipping it, so we put it on so that the fabric is going away from where we're trying to stitch it, because it's going to flip back up. You have to remember these things. Tricky. When you're working back to front, it's always a bit difficult to get used to the idea. So again, if you're not sure, fold along the line that you're going to be sewing, then you can cover that, make sure that you've got enough width there for it to pop back up again. It's all looking pretty good. It's not a very big area, in fact. So I'm just going to stitch across there, right out to the seam allowance edge. And now, because I'd stitched beyond my line there, I just need to pull that paper away from where I've stitched so that I can fold it on the stitched line, and just trim off that about 1/4 inch seam allowance there. And I can bring the iron over again and press that. This is just one of those things that once you've done it a few times, it makes sense. Sometimes you have to do it more than once for it to make sense. And then this piece here, we need to put on piece number 5. So same thing, it's going to flip down, so I've got to make sure that there's going to be enough fabric covering that, and then I can trim it back afterwards. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch across that line. That one was pretty straightforward. So I have gone ahead and got the other pieces ready because it's much the same as we've been doing. Let's trim this first. Now I had stitched that right down there, so I just need to pull that away from the paper, fold it back on the line, and just trim that seam. And now I can press that, and then the whole piece is done as far as the stitching for that segment's concerned, but it does now need to be all trimmed down because it's a little bit unsightly, just like that. So now we're going to be trimming on this dotted line or dashed line, because that's 1/4 inch away from the stitching line. So the stitching line that we're talking about is this solid line that sets the frame for that segment. So we just make up lots of little segments that we can join together with all these funny little shapes, and we end up with something that's really amazing because of all the angles and things that you'd have difficulty with if you were just cutting shapes to piece. So that's my coffee pot spout. When it's put against a coffee pot, it kind of looks a bit like a spout. So as I said, I've already made the other shapes. when we were doing the coffee cup here, we did some little tiny bits for the handle, so we've got a very similar process for the coffee pot handle. So I've already gone ahead and done those because it was just the same as the last video. So now we're pretty much ready to start assembling. So we can see that this spout can already go to the pot, but we might do some of these other little bits first. So what we need to do is we need to join this piece of handle to this piece of handle. So that's going to be E to F, so that we can then attach G to that. So G is just a piece of fabric that I've cut to size so that it's already got the paper on the back. So I'm going to go ahead and sew these two together. We're going to have a coffee pot in no time. It must be nearly coffee time. So just 1/4 inch seam allowance, that should be stitching right along that line. And I'm going to press those seams open so that there's not too much bulk there. I'm also going to put this on here, so I just want to trim away some of this paper that's going to be sitting in the seam area, because it's not helpful to have all that in there, because we're going to have to pull the paper out later, and if we've stitched it all down it's even harder to pull out. So just the bits that are in the seam allowance, not necessarily all of it. And then I'm going to put my piece G onto my EF combo. So that's going to go just there. Everything should be fitting nicely. So there's only a little skinny handle there. These are not very big blocks. I thought they were quite appealing this size. You could make them larger. Just pressing that seam open as well. And now I need to attach this piece to the top, which is piece C. So again, I just want to pull out these bits of paper that are in that stitch seam allowance area. Oops. So I could pull the whole lot out, but I don't really want to do that yet. I'd like to keep the block more or less together until I'm ready to dismantle all the paper. So this can go across here. So the coffee pot has a lot of segments. That does make it seem just a little daunting, but I think if you just go segment by segment, it's really not so bad. Again, I'm going to press that seam open. So that's going to be a little handle there, and then this piece goes on below the handle to give us the whole side so that we can stitch it to the side of the coffee pot. So I'm actually going to go ahead now and stitch all that together so that because now it's pretty much all straight lines. You know how this is all done. This one's going there, it's going on there, and that's going on there, then that's going to there, onto there. I'll come back shortly and show you some progress. So I've gone ahead, I've stitched all my little handle, and I've stitched it onto the pot, and I've stitched the spout on as well. When I pressed the handle, I've pressed that seam all one way rather than opening it, because there's quite a few little seams here that it'll just want to go that way. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to press this one. It seems to want to go that way, and I have this theory that if you let it go where it wants to go, it'll probably stay there. So this is my pot without a lid yet, but I've gone ahead, I've joined the lid to its little knob on top, so that just needs joining. So I'll do that now, and then we'll have a coffee pot. How exciting is that? So that's my lid on my pot. I'm probably going to press that seam open, I think. there we have a coffee pot. So I'm pretty pleased with that. I think that's looking pretty good. It's very much like the diagram that we had to start with. So we now have a coffee pot and a coffee cup. What more could you want in life? So I'll pin that up. So that's block 8 done. I think we're getting along really well with these blocks. I hope you're doing well with yours. And please go to GourmetQuilter.com, tasty treats if you'd like to know some more information. Otherwise, we'll see you back here to do foundation piece block number 9. Thank you.